In 1947, the state began sharing 4.6% of all sales tax revenues designated for its general fund with municipalities. This was done in recognition of their contributions to the state's economic health and vitality and of the burden borne by city taxpayers to fuel the state's economy. From 1947 to 1991, the state increased its sales tax rate on 5 separate occasions. In each instance, the additional revenues associated with this rate increase were designated for the state's general fund. And, in each instance, the sharing arrangement created in 1947 was preserved, with the state continuing to share 4.6% of all of its state sales tax collections with municipalities. Then, in 1993, the state increased the sales tax rate a 6th time, from 5.5% to 6%. However, unlike prior increases, the additional revenues associated with this 0.5% increase were not designated for the state's general fund. Instead, the portion of state sales tax collections attributable to the 93 increase were earmarked to fund the newly developed Basic Education Plan, or BEP. Despite this change, the historical sharing arrangement between the state and municipalities was preserved, as the state continued to share 4.6% of all state sales tax revenue designated for the general fund. In 2002, the state faced a severe budget shortfall and enacted a combination of budget reductions and revenue increases to balance the state's budget. Among the revenue measures adopted was an increase in the state sales tax rate from 6% to 7%. As with the increases adopted prior to 93, the associated revenues were designated for the state general fund. However, unlike the prior increases, the state elected not to share these general fund revenues with municipalities. Instead, the state chose to keep 100% of the revenues derived from the 1% increase for itself, so that it could close the budget shortfall and avoid fiscal calamity. In doing so, the state broke its 55-year sharing arrangement with cities and towns. Now, nearly 20 years removed from those dire times, the state has enjoyed a solid decade of positive economic performance and budget results. Yet, this historical sharing arrangement has not been restored. As a result of breaking the historical relationship in 2002, an additional $838 million has accrued to the state rather than being shared with municipalities. Unfortunately, the 1% increase in the state sales tax rate and the decision to break the 55-year-old sharing arrangement with municipalities was not sufficient to avoid a fiscal crisis. The state adopted a second measure in 2002 that increased state revenues to the detriment of local governments. This additional measure doubled the amount of the purchase price of a single item that is subject to state and local sales tax. Prior to 2002, the first $1,600 of the purchase price of any single item was subject to state and local sales tax. The state elected to increase this cap, making the first $3,200 of the purchase price of any single item subject to state and local sales tax. However, doubling this single article cap was not enough to balance the budget, so the 2002 change also provided that any additional revenue generated by applying the 2.75% that is ordinarily reserved for local governments was to be retained by the state. Last year, an additional $72 million accrued to the state as a result of this change, and more than $951 million has accrued to the state instead of local governments since 2002. Your TMO team has joined you in advocating for the restoration of the historical revenue sharing relationship and increasing the single article cap. These advocacy efforts have occurred at all levels of state government and with members of the General Assembly. While we have yet to secure enactment of a permanent legislative change to reverse the changes adopted in 2002, your TML team's efforts have not been without benefit. First, the $100 million in non-recurring state grants awarded to municipalities during the 2020 fiscal year, as well as the $50 million in grants awarded in 2021, were the direct result of the engagement of members of the board of your TML team with Governor Lee, key state commissioners, and leaders of the General Assembly. Second, while the current General Assembly was not responsible for these changes, our collective advocacy efforts have resulted in a greater awareness of these inequities and an acknowledgement by administration officials and some legislators of the need to address these issues on a more permanent basis. To date, the resistance to a permanent solution has been based upon the lack of recurring revenues. While the state has realized significant surpluses in recent years, these have been one-time, non-recurring surpluses. Thus, the financial assistance offered to local governments has been in the form of non-recurring grants. However, this year presents an opening, as the state has a surplus of recurring dollars. The TMO board has directed that both restoring the historical sharing arrangement, and amending the law to allow local governments to receive sales tax revenues realized on items with a purchase price above $1,600 remain a legislative priority. A permanent solution to either of these inequities may be possible in this limited window of time. However, there are numerous proposals and state priorities competing for these same limited recurring dollars. If we are to be successful, it will require a unified and all-in effort of municipal officials.